The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as consciousness slowly returned to the woman lying in bed, 7 of the intensive care unit at St. Mary's Hospital. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing dark brown eyes that moved frantically around the sterile white room, searching for something familiar, some anchor point in a world that felt completely foreign and terrifying. If you enjoy stories like this, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any new stories. It really helps us out, and don't forget to leave your comment about the story. Now let's continue. Doctor, Rebecca Martinez approached the bed cautiously, having seen many patients wake up from trauma-induced comas, but none quite like this one. The woman had been found 3 days earlier, unconscious and badly injured, at the bottom of a ravine about 30 miles outside the city. No identification, no personal belongings, no missing person reports that matched her description. She was a mystery, wrapped in medical bandages and unanswered questions. "Good morning," Dr. Martinez said gently, her voice deliberately calm and reassuring. "You're in St. Mary's Hospital. You've been unconscious for 3 days. Can you tell me your name?" The woman in the bed tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. She cleared her throat and tried again. I don't know." The words hung in the air, like a confession of something far more serious than a simple medical condition. "Doctor." Martinez had expected this response. The head trauma indicated possible memory loss, but the extent wouldn't be clear until they could run more comprehensive tests. "That's okay. Memory issues are common after the type of head injury you sustained. Can you tell me anything at all about yourself? Where you live? What you do for work?" "Family members?" The woman closed her eyes and concentrated, her brow furrowing with the effort of trying to access memories that seemed to exist just beyond her reach. It was like trying to grab smoke with her bare hands. The harder she tried, the more elusive the memories became. "Nothing," she whispered, and Dr. Martinez could hear the fear creeping into her voice. "It's all empty, like there's nothing there at all." But even as she spoke those words, something else was stirring in the woman's mind. While her personal memories remained locked away, other knowledge seemed perfectly intact. She found herself automatically assessing Dr. Martinez's body language, noting the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested she was withholding information. She observed the way the doctor's eyes briefly darted to the chart in her hands, and she instinctively knew that whatever was written, there wasn't entirely good news. These observations felt natural and automatic, like breathing or blinking. She didn't remember learning to read people this way, but the skills were clearly there, as sharp and reliable as ever. "Doctor," she said, her voice growing stronger, "you're not telling me everything. What happened to me? How was I found?" Dr. Martinez was surprised by the directness of the question and the keen intelligence behind it. Most amnesia patients were confused and disoriented for much longer periods. This woman seemed to be conducting an interview rather than simply trying to understand her medical condition. "You were found by hikers at the bottom of Copper Creek Ravine," Dr. Martinez explained carefully. "You had sustained significant head trauma, some broken ribs, and various cuts and bruises consistent with a fall. The police investigation is ongoing, but there's no indication yet of how you ended up there or what caused your injuries." The woman processed this information with the systematic approach of someone accustomed to analyzing evidence and drawing conclusions from incomplete data. "Was I alone when I was found? Any sign of a vehicle nearby? What about personal belongings?" Dr. Martinez exchanged a glance with Nurse Johnson, who had been observing the conversation from the corner of the room. This level of detailed questioning was unusual for someone who had just regained consciousness after a traumatic brain injury, No vehicle, no personal belongings, no identification, Dr. Martinez replied. The police canvassed the area thoroughly, but they didn't find anything that might help identify you or explain what happened. The woman nodded, already mentally cataloguing the information and forming preliminary theories about her situation. The analytical part of her mind was working perfectly, even if her personal memories remained inaccessible. She began to understand that she had two distinct problems to solve: her medical condition and the mystery of her identity and what had happened to her. Over the next few days, as her physical condition stabilized, the woman became increasingly frustrated by her inability to remember anything about her personal life. The medical staff had started calling her Jane since they needed some way to refer to her, but the name felt foreign and wrong whenever she heard it. What didn't feel foreign were the questions that kept forming in her mind about her situation. Why had no one reported her missing? How had she ended up injured at the bottom of a ravine with no identification? What had she been doing in that remote area? The more she thought about these questions, the more convinced she became that there was something deliberate and sinister about her circumstances. During her second week in the hospital, Detective Mike Sullivan from the local police department came to interview her. He was a tired-looking man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that seemed designed to put witnesses at ease. But as soon as he started asking questions, the woman found herself analyzing his technique and mentally noting areas where his approach could be more effective. "I know this is difficult," Detective Sullivan began, "but anything you can remember about the days or hours before you were found could be helpful in our investigation." The woman shook her head. "I've told the doctors everything I can remember, which is essentially nothing about my personal life or recent events. But I can tell you that your investigation is missing some important elements." Detective Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what makes you say that?" "You haven't established a timeline for when I might have been injured versus when I was found. The hikers discovered me on a Tuesday morning, but when did they first notice I wasn't there on previous hikes? You haven't checked with local hotels and motels to see if anyone matching my description checked in recently and then disappeared. You haven't analyzed the injury patterns to determine whether they're consistent with an accidental fall or something more deliberate." Detective Sullivan stared at her for a moment, then pulled out his notebook and started writing. "Those are all excellent points. Do you have some kind of background in law enforcement or investigation?" The woman considered the question carefully. "I don't remember specifically, but it feels natural to think about evidence and investigative procedures. It's like muscle memory, but for analytical thinking." After Detective Sullivan left, promising to follow up on her suggestions, the woman made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of her recovery. If the police investigation wasn't moving fast enough, and if she had what appeared to be investigative skills, then she would conduct her own investigation into her identity and what had happened to her. She started by making detailed notes about everything she could observe and remember since waking up in the hospital. She documented her injuries, the location where she was found, the lack of personal belongings, and the absence of any missing person reports that matched her description. She treated herself as a case file, approaching her own situation with the same methodical thoroughness she would apply to any other mystery. The hospital staff was initially concerned about her obsessive note-taking and constant questions about investigative procedures, but Dr. Martinez eventually recognized that the mental stimulation might actually be helpful for her recovery. She arranged for the woman to have access to a computer and basic internet research capabilities, hoping that engaging her obviously sharp, analytical mind might help trigger some personal memories. What Dr. Martinez didn't anticipate was how quickly and thoroughly the woman would throw herself into investigating her own case. Within days, she had created a comprehensive database of information about herself, cross-referenced with local missing person reports, unsolved cases, and any other relevant data she could access from her hospital bed. She started by analyzing the physical evidence of her condition and circumstances. Her injuries were consistent with a fall, but there were some anomalies that bothered her. The distribution of bruises suggested she had been grabbed or restrained before the fall occurred. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms that indicated she had fought back against someone. Most tellingly, there were faint marks around her wrists that looked like they could have been left by restraints. "Dr. Martinez," she said during one of their regular check-ins, "I think what happened to me wasn't an accident. I think someone took me to that ravine deliberately and either pushed me or expected the fall to kill me." Dr. Martinez reviewed the medical photos and injury documentation with fresh eyes, considering the woman's analysis. "You could be right," she admitted. "But even if that's the case, we still don't know who you are or who might have wanted to hurt you." "That's what I need to figure out," the woman replied. "And I think I know where to start." She had been studying missing person databases and had identified several women who had disappeared in the region over the past few months. None of them matched her exactly, but she had learned that missing person reports weren't always accurate or complete. People could be missing for weeks before anyone reported them gone. They could be reported missing under incorrect names or with outdated descriptions. They could disappear in one jurisdiction and turn up injured in another, creating gaps in information sharing. What she needed was to expand her search and start looking for patterns that might connect her situation to other cases or ongoing investigations. She needed to think like a detective working a complex case, because that's exactly what she was doing. Using the hospital's computer, she began reaching out to missing person organizations, online databases, and cold case forums. She posted her own photo and description, asking if anyone recognized her or had information about similar cases. She contacted local newspapers and asked them to run a story about her situation, hoping that someone who knew her would see it and come forward. But most importantly, she started looking for active criminal investigations that might be related to her situation. If she had been deliberately hurt and left for dead, there was probably a reason beyond random violence. She might have been a witness to something, or involved in an investigation, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time during some criminal activity. The breakthrough came during her third week in the hospital, when she was contacted by Maria Santos, a victim's advocate who had seen the newspaper story about her case. Maria explained that she worked with women who had been trafficked or who had escaped from dangerous situations, and that the circumstances of the woman's case reminded her of several other incidents she had encountered. The pattern of leaving someone injured in a remote location, the lack of identification, the injuries that suggest restraint and struggle. "I've seen this before," Maria explained during their phone conversation. "Usually it happens to women who are trying to help victims of trafficking or who were investigating criminal networks." This information crystallized something in the woman's mind. She couldn't remember specifics, but the topic of human trafficking felt familiar and important to her. When she researched trafficking cases in the region, she felt a sense of recognition and urgency that suggested this was connected to her own situation. She began to focus her research on human trafficking investigations in the area, looking for any cases that might have involved a female investigator or victim's advocate who had recently gone missing. This was more challenging than her previous research, because active investigations weren't usually publicized, but she was persistent and creative in her approach. She contacted law enforcement agencies, private investigation firms, and victim advocacy organizations, asking if they had any female employees or volunteers who had recently stopped showing up for work or who had been involved in trafficking-related investigations. She explained her own situation and asked them to check their records for anyone matching her description who might have been working on related cases. The response from Riverside County Sheriff's Department came on a Thursday morning during her 4th week in the hospital. Detective Lisa Chen called to say that they had a private investigator who had been working on a trafficking case for them, who had missed several scheduled meetings and hadn't been responding to calls or emails. Her name is Sarah Chen, Detective Lisa Chen explained. She's 34, Asian American, about 5'6", dark hair, brown eyes. She's been working with us for about 6 months on a case involving a trafficking network that operates between here and the city. We've been concerned about her because she was supposed to deliver a report last week, and we haven't heard from her. The woman felt a jolt of recognition when she heard the name Sarah Chen, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why it seemed familiar. "Can you send me her photo?" she asked. "I'd like to compare it with my own appearance." When the photo arrived via email an hour later, the woman stared at it in shock. The face looking back at her from the computer screen was unmistakably her own. Same dark eyes, same facial structure, same shoulder-length black hair. She was looking at a professional headshot of herself, though she had no memory of when or where it had been taken. "Dr. Martinez," she called out, her voice shaking with excitement and disbelief. "I think I know who I am." Dr. Martinez hurried over to the computer screen and examined the photo alongside the woman's face. The resemblance was undeniable. This was clearly the same person. "Sarah Chen," the woman said, testing the name on her tongue. It felt right in a way that Jane never had. "I'm Sarah Chen, and I'm a private investigator who was working on a human trafficking case when I disappeared." The identification of Sarah Chen opened up entirely new avenues of investigation, but it also raised disturbing questions about what had happened to her and why. Detective Lisa Chen arranged to visit the hospital the next day to brief Sarah on the case she had been working on and to try to determine what might have led to her attack and disappearance. "You were investigating a network that we believe is responsible for trafficking women through several states," Detective Lisa Chen explained during their meeting. "The operation appears to be sophisticated, with connections to legitimate businesses that provide cover for their activities. You had identified several key locations and were working to gather evidence about the people involved." Sarah listened intently, hoping that hearing about her work would trigger some memories, but the details remained frustratingly just beyond her reach. However, her investigative instincts were as sharp as ever, and she immediately began asking questions about the case and the evidence that had been gathered so far. "What was I supposed to deliver in my report last week?" Sarah asked. "What had I discovered that was important enough for someone to try to kill me?" Detective Lisa Chen hesitated before answering. "We're not entirely sure. Your last communication with us was 3 weeks ago, when you said you were close to identifying the main organizer of the network. You mentioned that you had found connections between the trafficking operation and some legitimate businesses, possibly including some people in positions of authority who were providing protection for the criminals." The implication was clear. Sarah had been getting close to exposing people with power and resources, people who had both the motivation and the capability to eliminate threats to their operation. Her disappearance and near-fatal accident were almost certainly connected to her investigation. "I need to see all the files on this case," Sarah said. "Everything I had been working on, all the evidence I had gathered, every report I had submitted. If I was close to a breakthrough, then the answers are in there somewhere." Detective Lisa Chen was hesitant to share active investigation files with a civilian, even if that civilian was the private investigator who had been working on the case. But Sarah's arguments were persuasive. She had been conducting this investigation for months and probably knew the case better than anyone else, even if she couldn't currently remember those details. Her unique perspective as both the investigator and the victim might reveal connections that others had missed. More pragmatically, Sarah was the only witness to what had happened to her, even if she couldn't currently access those memories. Refreshing her knowledge of the case might help trigger the return of her personal memories, which could provide crucial evidence about the people who had attacked her. After consulting with her supervisors and the district attorney's office, Detective Lisa Chen decided to share the case files with Sarah under carefully controlled conditions. Sarah would review the materials at the sheriff's department under supervision and would not be allowed to take any documents with her or make copies of sensitive information. The next morning, Sarah was discharged from the hospital with instructions to continue her recovery as an outpatient. Her first stop was the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, where she was given access to a conference room and several boxes of files related to the trafficking investigation. As Sarah opened the first file and began reading through her own investigative reports, she felt like she was reading about someone else's work. The writing style was clearly her own, and the analytical approach matched her natural thinking patterns, but she had no memory of conducting the interviews, gathering the evidence, or reaching the conclusions documented in the reports. According to her own notes, she had been investigating the trafficking network for 6 months, starting with a missing person case involving a 19-year-old woman named Amy Rodriguez. Amy had disappeared from her college campus under suspicious circumstances, and her family had hired Sarah to investigate when the police case went cold. Sarah's investigation had revealed that Amy's disappearance was connected to a larger pattern of young women being recruited and then vanishing from colleges and universities throughout the region. The recruitment typically involved job offers or modeling opportunities that seemed legitimate, but led to women being trafficked into forced labor or prostitution. As Sarah read through her own investigative notes, she began to understand the scope and sophistication of the criminal network she had been investigating. The operation involved multiple layers of legitimate businesses that provided cover for illegal activities, including a modeling agency, a job placement service, and several transportation companies. Most disturbing of all, Sarah's notes indicated that she had identified evidence of official corruption. Several law enforcement officials appeared to be receiving payments to ignore certain activities or to provide advance warning of planned raids and investigations. This corruption network made the trafficking operation much more difficult to investigate and prosecute because the criminals often knew about police activities before they happened. Sarah's final report, dated 3 weeks before her disappearance, indicated that she was close to identifying the person or persons at the center of both the trafficking network and the corruption scheme. She had traced financial connections and communication patterns that pointed to a small group of individuals who appeared to be coordinating the various criminal activities. But the report ended abruptly with a note that she needed to verify some additional information before she could conclusively identify the main organizers. This verification process was apparently what she had been working on when she disappeared. As Sarah read through the files, she began to reconstruct not just the case she had been investigating, but her own investigation methodology and thinking patterns. Even without her memories, she could see how her mind worked, how she approached complex problems, and how she built cases through careful documentation and logical analysis. More importantly, she began to understand what had probably happened to her. She had been closing in on powerful people who had both criminal enterprises and official connections to protect. They had identified her as a threat and had acted to eliminate that threat before she could expose them. The fact that she was still alive suggested that they either thought they had killed her or that they believed her memory loss would prevent her from continuing to be a danger to their operation. They had probably assumed that even if she survived the fall, the head trauma would leave her unable to remember or investigate what she had discovered. They had been wrong on both counts. Sarah spent the rest of the week reviewing her case files and beginning to reconstruct the investigation from her own notes and evidence. She approached it like any other cold case, except that she had the unusual advantage of having conducted the original investigation herself, even if she couldn't remember doing it. She started by mapping out the network of businesses and individuals involved in the trafficking operation, using her own notes and reports to create a comprehensive picture of how the criminal enterprise functioned. She identified the key players, the financial connections, and the methods used to recruit and transport victims. But most importantly, she focused on the evidence she had been gathering about official corruption. This was clearly the most dangerous aspect of her investigation, and it was probably what had led to the attempt on her life. According to her notes, she had identified several law enforcement officials who appeared to be receiving regular payments from the trafficking network. She had documented suspicious patterns in how certain cases were handled, how information seemed to leak from official investigations, and how planned operations were often ineffective because the targets had been warned in advance. The corruption network appeared to include officials from multiple agencies, including local police, county sheriff's departments, and possibly federal law enforcement. This coordination suggested that someone with significant authority and access was organizing the corruption scheme and ensuring that the trafficking network remained protected. Sarah's investigation had been getting close to identifying this central organizer when she disappeared. Her notes indicated that she had narrowed the possibilities down to 3 individuals, all of whom had the access, authority, and connections necessary to coordinate the corruption network. The first suspect was Captain Robert Morrison from the City Police Department, who supervised several of the officers who appeared to be involved in the corruption scheme. Morrison had access to information about ongoing investigations and the authority to influence how cases were assigned and investigated. The second suspect was District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who had ultimate authority over which cases were prosecuted and how vigorously they were pursued. Walsh's office had been notably unsuccessful in prosecuting trafficking cases, despite what appeared to be strong evidence in several instances. The third suspect was FBI Special Agent David Park, who served as liaison between local law enforcement and federal agencies on trafficking cases. Park had access to information from multiple jurisdictions and could influence how federal resources were allocated to investigate trafficking networks. Sarah's notes indicated that she had been working to gather additional evidence about these 3 suspects when she disappeared. She had been particularly focused on their financial records and communication patterns, looking for direct evidence of their involvement in the corruption scheme. As Sarah studied her own investigation notes, she began to form theories about which of these suspects was most likely to be the central organizer. She also began to understand that resuming this investigation would be extremely dangerous, because whoever had tried to kill her once would certainly try again if they realized she was continuing her work. But Sarah also realized that she was in a unique position to solve this case. The criminals believed she was either dead or incapacitated by memory loss. They didn't know that she had retained her investigative skills or that she had access to all her previous research and evidence. She could continue the investigation while maintaining the element of surprise. More importantly, she now had additional evidence that hadn't been available during her original investigation: the circumstances of her own disappearance and attempted murder. The timing, location, and method used to attack her provided new clues about who was responsible and how the criminal network operated. Sarah decided to continue her investigation, but with much greater attention to her personal safety and security. She would assume that her communications were being monitored, that her movements were being watched, and that anyone connected to her case might be compromised by the corruption network. She started by reaching out to Maria Santos, the victim's advocate, who had first contacted her in the hospital. Maria worked for a non-profit organization that was independent of law enforcement agencies, which meant she was less likely to be compromised by the corruption scheme. She also had extensive knowledge of trafficking operations and might be able to provide insights that official investigators couldn't offer. "I think I know why someone tried to kill me," Sarah explained during their meeting at Maria's office. "I was getting close to exposing a corruption network that protects trafficking operations. The people involved have access to law enforcement information and enough authority to interfere with investigations." Maria nodded grimly. "That matches what we've suspected for months. We've noticed patterns in how certain cases are handled, how information seems to leak, and how our clients sometimes disappear right before they're supposed to testify or provide evidence." Sarah showed Maria her investigation notes and asked for her insights about the 3 main suspects she had identified. Maria was familiar with all 3 individuals and had observed their professional behavior in trafficking-related cases. "District Attorney Walsh has been the most problematic from our perspective," Maria said. "Her office consistently declines to prosecute trafficking cases even when the evidence seems strong. They always find technical reasons or procedural problems that make prosecution impossible." "What about Captain Morrison and Agent Park?" Sarah asked. "Morrison's officers have been involved in several situations where victims disappeared or evidence went missing," Maria explained. "Park is harder to read, but he seems to have advanced knowledge of operations that are supposed to be secret. Targets often seem to know when raids are coming." This information confirmed Sarah's analysis and helped her focus on Jennifer Walsh as the most likely central organizer of the corruption network. As district attorney, Walsh had the authority to protect the trafficking network by refusing to prosecute cases, dismissing charges on technical grounds, or ensuring that plea agreements were favorable to defendants. Walsh also had access to information about ongoing investigations from multiple law enforcement agencies, which she could share with the trafficking network to help them avoid detection and prosecution. Her position gave her both the motivation and the capability to coordinate a comprehensive protection scheme for criminal enterprises. Sarah decided to focus her renewed investigation on gathering direct evidence of Walsh's involvement in the corruption scheme. This would be extremely dangerous because Walsh would have access to law enforcement resources and could potentially arrange for Sarah to disappear permanently if she discovered the investigation. But Sarah also realized that she had advantages that her previous investigation had lacked. She now knew that there was a corruption network and had identified its likely leader. She understood that her communications and movements were probably being monitored. Most importantly, she had the motivation of someone who had been personally targeted for murder by the people she was investigating. Sarah began her renewed investigation by carefully reconstructing her activities during the weeks before her disappearance. She used her own notes, calendar entries, and communication records to determine exactly what she had been doing and who she had been in contact with during that time period. What she discovered was that she had been preparing to meet with a potential witness who claimed to have direct evidence of Walsh's involvement in the corruption scheme. The witness was a former employee of Walsh's office who said she had overheard phone conversations and seen documents that proved Walsh was coordinating with the trafficking network. According to Sarah's notes, this meeting was supposed to take place at a remote location where they wouldn't be observed or overheard. The location was Copper Creek Ravine, the same place where Sarah had been found injured and unconscious. This discovery provided crucial evidence about what had happened to Sarah and who was responsible. She had gone to meet a witness who could provide evidence against District Attorney Walsh. Instead of meeting the witness, she had been attacked and left for dead at the meeting location. This suggested that Walsh had learned about the planned meeting and had arranged for Sarah to be eliminated before she could gather the promised evidence. The witness might have been working for Walsh, or the real witness might have been threatened or killed to prevent the meeting from taking place. Sarah realized that she needed to be extremely careful about how she proceeded with this investigation. If Walsh suspected that Sarah had recovered her memory and was resuming her investigation, she would certainly arrange for Sarah to be killed more effectively this time. Sarah decided to gather evidence against Walsh through indirect methods that wouldn't alert her to the renewed investigation. She would use her investigative skills and access to public records to build a case against Walsh without directly confronting her or anyone connected to her. She started by analyzing financial records that were available through public databases and court filings. If Walsh was receiving payments from the trafficking network, there might be evidence of unexplained income or suspicious financial transactions. Sarah also began tracking Walsh's professional decisions in trafficking-related cases, looking for patterns that suggested she was deliberately protecting certain defendants or sabotaging prosecutions. She requested copies of case files, plea agreements, and court transcripts that would document Walsh's handling of trafficking cases. Most importantly, Sarah began reaching out to other victims and advocates who had been affected by the trafficking network and the apparent corruption in the prosecutor's office. She was careful to approach these contacts indirectly and to avoid revealing that she was conducting an active investigation. Through these conversations, Sarah began to understand the full scope of the damage caused by the corruption network. Dozens of trafficking cases had been dismissed or resulted in minimal penalties for defendants. Victims had been intimidated or threatened to prevent them from testifying. Evidence had mysteriously disappeared from police custody before trials could take place. The pattern was clear and consistent. Someone with significant authority and access was systematically sabotaging efforts to investigate and prosecute the trafficking network. All of the evidence pointed to Jennifer Walsh as the person responsible for coordinating this protection scheme. But Sarah knew that having evidence and being able to prove it in court were two different things. Walsh had the resources and connections to fight any accusations against her, and she had demonstrated that she was willing to use violence to protect her criminal enterprise. Sarah needed to find a way to expose Walsh's corruption without putting herself in danger and without giving Walsh the opportunity to destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses. She needed to approach this like a complex undercover operation, where revealing her true objectives too early would be fatal to both the investigation and potentially to herself. The solution came from an unexpected source. Amy Rodriguez, the 19-year-old college student whose disappearance had started Sarah's original investigation. Amy was still missing, but her family had never stopped looking for her, and they had been following Sarah's investigation closely. Amy's sister Jessica contacted Sarah after hearing about her memory loss and recovery. Jessica explained that Amy had left behind a laptop computer that the family had been unable to access because it was password protected. They had hoped that Sarah might be able to help them access the computer to look for clues about Amy's disappearance. Sarah agreed to examine the laptop, and what she found exceeded her expectations. Amy had been suspicious about the job opportunities and modeling offers she had received, and she had been documenting her interactions with the people involved. Her laptop contained emails, photos, and notes that provided direct evidence of how the trafficking recruitment process worked. More importantly, Amy's laptop contained evidence that she had been in communication with someone in the district attorney's office who had been asking her questions about the people who had recruited her. The email address was associated with Jennifer Walsh's office, and the questions suggested that someone was trying to gather intelligence about law enforcement knowledge of the trafficking network. This discovery provided Sarah with the direct evidence she needed to prove Walsh's involvement in protecting the trafficking network. Amy had been recruited by the criminal organization, But she had also been contacted by someone in Walsh's office who appeared to be gathering information for the traffickers. Sarah realized that Amy's disappearance might have been ordered by Walsh after Amy started asking too many questions or became suspicious about the motives of her contact in the prosecutor's office. Amy hadn't just been a victim of trafficking. She had been a potential witness who needed to be eliminated before she could expose the corruption scheme. With this new evidence, Sarah finally had the proof she needed to expose both the trafficking network and the corruption scheme that protected it. But she also understood that presenting this evidence through normal channels would be futile, because Walsh controlled the prosecution process and could suppress or discredit any evidence against her. Sarah needed to find a way to present her evidence to someone outside of Walsh's influence, someone who had the authority and resources to investigate corruption at the highest levels of local law enforcement and prosecution. She decided to contact the FBI's Internal Affairs Division and the State Attorney General's office, both of which had jurisdiction over corruption cases involving local officials. She also reached out to investigative journalists who specialized in covering government corruption and criminal justice issues. But before she could present her evidence to these outside authorities, Sarah wanted to gather one final piece of proof that would make her case irrefutable. She decided to attempt to recover her memories of the events leading up to her disappearance, hoping that she could provide eyewitness testimony about what had happened to her and who was responsible. Sarah worked with Dr. Martinez and a specialist in memory recovery to use various techniques that might help trigger the return of her memories. They used photographs, documents, and location visits to stimulate her recollection of the weeks before her disappearance. The breakthrough came when Sarah visited the Copper Creek Ravine area where she had been found. Standing at the edge of the ravine, looking down at the location where she had lain unconscious for hours, something clicked in her mind. She remembered driving to the ravine for her meeting with the supposed witness. She remembered waiting at the designated location and becoming suspicious when no one appeared. She remembered the sound of vehicles approaching and realizing that she was in danger. Most clearly, she remembered seeing Jennifer Walsh emerge from one of the vehicles, accompanied by two men who were clearly not law enforcement officers. She remembered Walsh explaining that Sarah had become too much of a threat to their operation and that her investigation needed to end permanently. Sarah remembered fighting back when the men tried to grab her, which explained the defensive wounds on her hands and arms. She remembered Walsh ordering the men to make it look like an accident, and she remembered the moment when they pushed her over the edge of the ravine. Most importantly, she remembered Walsh standing at the edge of the ravine after Sarah fell, looking down to make sure she was dead. Walsh had been personally involved in the attempt to murder Sarah, which meant that Sarah could provide direct eyewitness testimony about the crime. With her memories recovered and her evidence compiled, Sarah finally had everything she needed to expose the corruption network and bring the people responsible to justice. She contacted the FBI and the State Attorney General simultaneously, providing them with comprehensive evidence of the trafficking network, the official corruption that protected it, and the attempt on her own life that had been ordered by District Attorney Jennifer Walsh. The federal investigation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Armed with Sarah's evidence, testimony, and recovered memories, FBI agents conducted simultaneous raids on Walsh's office, her home, and the various businesses that had been fronting for the trafficking network. They seized computers, financial records, communication devices, and other evidence that corroborated Sarah's investigation findings. Jennifer Walsh was arrested at her office on charges of conspiracy, racketeering, obstruction of justice, and attempted murder. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Financial records showing regular payments from the trafficking network, communication logs proving she had been coordinating with criminal organizations, and testimony from multiple witnesses who could verify her involvement in covering up trafficking cases. Captain Robert Morrison and FBI Special Agent David Park were also arrested as part of the coordinated operation. Sarah's investigation had been correct in identifying all three as key components of the corruption network, though Walsh had indeed been the central organizer and primary coordinator. But perhaps most satisfying for Sarah was the rescue of Amy Rodriguez and 6 other women who had been held captive by the trafficking network. The evidence on Amy's laptop, combined with Sarah's investigation files, had provided law enforcement with the locations where victims were being held. Amy had been missing for 8 months, but she was alive and could finally return to her family. The prosecutions that followed resulted in convictions for more than 20 people involved in the trafficking network and corruption scheme. Jennifer Walsh was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison, while Morrison and Park received sentences of 25 and 20 years, respectively. The case attracted national attention, both because of the scope of the criminal network and because of the unique circumstances of Sarah's investigation. The story of a private investigator who solved her own attempted murder case while suffering from amnesia became a symbol of how determination and investigative skills could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. Sarah's recovery continued over the following months, with most of her memories eventually returning. The trauma of her attack and near-death experience remained difficult to process, but she found purpose in using her experience to help other victims of trafficking and corruption. She established a non-profit organization dedicated to investigating cases where official corruption interfered with the prosecution of serious crimes. The organization worked closely with victim advocates like Maria Santos and with federal authorities who had jurisdiction over corruption cases. Sarah also wrote a book about her experience, detailing both the investigation she had conducted before her disappearance and the unique process of solving her own case while suffering from amnesia. The book became a bestseller and helped raise awareness about both human trafficking and the corruption that often protects criminal networks. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah's case led to significant reforms in how trafficking cases were investigated and prosecuted. New protocols were established to prevent corruption from interfering with investigations, and oversight mechanisms were put in place to monitor the handling of trafficking cases by prosecutors and law enforcement agencies. The case also highlighted the importance of private investigators and victim advocates in addressing crimes that official agencies might be unable or unwilling to pursue effectively. Sarah's work demonstrated that sometimes the most important investigations are conducted by people outside the traditional law enforcement system. Dr. Martinez followed Sarah's recovery with professional interest and personal satisfaction. She had rarely seen a patient overcome such severe trauma while simultaneously using that trauma as motivation to achieve something extraordinary. Sarah's case became a textbook example of how psychological resilience and professional skills could work together to overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. Detective Lisa Chen, who had worked with Sarah during the original investigation, was promoted to captain after the successful prosecution of the corruption network. She credited Sarah's investigative work with breaking open a case that had been stalled by internal sabotage for years. The Sheriff's Department implemented new security protocols to prevent corruption from interfering with future investigations. Maria Santos continued her work with trafficking victims, but with renewed hope that the system could actually provide justice for the women she served. Sarah's case had proven that corruption networks could be exposed and prosecuted, even when they involved people in positions of significant authority. Amy Rodriguez recovered from her ordeal and became an advocate for other trafficking victims. She testified before Congress about the need for better protection for witnesses and victims, and she worked with Sarah's organization to investigate other cases where corruption might be interfering with prosecution efforts. The Copper Creek Ravine, where Sarah had been found, became an unlikely symbol of survival and determination. Sarah returned to the location on the anniversary of her attack, not to relive the trauma, but to celebrate how far she had come in her recovery, and to honor the other victims who had not been as fortunate as she had been. As Sarah stood at the edge of the ravine, looking down at the spot where she had lain broken and unconscious 2 years earlier, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. She had lost her memory, but retained her skills. She had been victimized, but had become a victor. She had been left for dead, but had used her survival to bring justice to others. The irony was not lost on her that the same analytical skills that had made her a target for murder had also enabled her to solve her own case and expose the criminal network that had tried to eliminate her. The criminals had underestimated both her resilience and her investigative abilities, and that underestimation had ultimately led to their downfall. Sarah's case became a permanent part of FBI training curriculum, used to teach agents about the importance of thorough investigation techniques and the dangers of corruption in law enforcement agencies. Her methods for reconstructing complex criminal networks and her systematic approach to analyzing evidence became models for other investigators working on similar cases. The medical community also studied Sarah's case with great interest, particularly her ability to retain professional skills while losing personal memories and her successful recovery from severe amnesia. Her case contributed to better understanding of how different types of memory function and how trauma affects cognitive abilities. But for Sarah personally, the most important outcome of her ordeal was not the professional recognition or the contributions to law enforcement training. It was the knowledge that she had used her skills and determination to save other victims and to prevent the criminal network from harming anyone else. She had solved the ultimate cold case, her own disappearance and attempted murder. In doing so, she had not only recovered her identity and her memories, but had also discovered new depths of resilience and purpose that she had never known she possessed. The woman who had awakened in a hospital bed with no memory of her identity had become someone stronger, more determined, and more committed to justice than she had ever been before. She had turned her victimization into empowerment, her trauma into triumph, and her near-death experience into a renewed commitment to protecting others who could not protect themselves. Sarah Chen had investigated and solved her own missing person case while she was still missing. In the process, she had discovered not just who she was, but who she was capable of becoming when faced with the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Her story became proof that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements emerge from the most devastating setbacks, and that the human capacity for resilience and justice can overcome even the most carefully planned criminal conspiracies. Years later, when Sarah was asked to speak to groups of law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and private investigators about her experience, she would always emphasize that her case was ultimately about the power of persistence and systematic investigation. She had not solved her case through luck or intuition, but through careful analysis, methodical evidence gathering, and refusing to accept that some crimes were too complex or too well protected to prosecute successfully. The skills that make someone a good investigator don't disappear just because your personal memories are gone, she would tell her audiences. If you know how to analyze evidence, how to identify patterns, and how to ask the right questions, you can solve almost any case if you're willing to put in the work and accept the risks. Sarah's story became a testament to the idea that justice is possible even in the most challenging circumstances, but only when someone is willing to pursue it with determination, courage, and the kind of systematic thoroughness that treats every case as solvable, no matter how complex or dangerous it might appear. The private investigator, who had awakened in a hospital bed with no memory of her own identity, had ultimately solved not just her own case, but had exposed an entire criminal network and corruption scheme that had been operating for years. She had turned her most vulnerable moment into her most powerful achievement, proving that sometimes the greatest victories emerge from the most devastating defeats. In the end, Sarah Chen had done something that seemed impossible. She had investigated and solved her own missing person case while she was still missing. In doing so, she had not only found herself, but had also ensured that the people who had tried to make her disappear would never have the opportunity to victimize anyone else. Her story became proof that sometimes the most important cases are solved not by official agencies or traditional methods, but by individuals who refuse to accept that justice is impossible, no matter how powerful the forces working against it might be. If you made it this far and haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't waste any time. Subscribe, turn on notifications, leave a like, and tell me in the comments. What did you think of this story? Thank you for watching, and see you next time.